A whole new world. The end of magic. Jafar's clothes faded and seemed to shrink back in on themselves. No longer in his magically created sultan robes, he now lay in his old Grand Vizir uniform. Sand trickled and eddied around his body, like it was already decaying in the desert. His voice grew ragged and weak. The world will forever be ordinary now. Good luck fixing everything in Agrabah without magic. You need it for happy endings, you know. With one more shuddering breath, he was gone. Before anyone could react to what had just happened, strange groans and horrible thunking noises came from the hallways. At first, Aladdin was confused by the sound. Then he realized the truth. The ghouls were returning to their natural state, dead. He closed his eyes, picturing Rasul in the banquet hall. He wished he knew a proper prayer for all of them. There were shouts of confusion and then triumph outside beyond the balcony. "No!" a strange voice shrieked. Everyone in the room turned to look at the genie, but he wasn't there. In his place stood an ordinary-sized man with ordinary flesh and hair, though his skin still had a faint bluish tinge. He was looking at his arms splaying out and his fingers twitching his toes. He snapped his fingers. Nothing happened. He pointed at a chair and murmured something. Nothing. A strangled cry came out of his throat. "Genie, you're no longer magical," Jasmine said, her voice filled with pity. She came over and put her arms around him. He didn't resist. "I never thought I'd be free again," he said hollowly. "And certainly not like this. I'm human, ordinary, normal." "Just because you don't have your powers," Aladdin began. "They weren't my powers," the genie snapped. "They were who I was, who all jinn are, who can do these things the same way you monkeys can walk upright or read books. It's the way we are born. Sorry," he added quickly, running a hand over his head. "It's just a lot to take in." "It's all a lot to take in," Aladdin said, looking around and finally resting his gaze on Duvan. His old friend stood there, looking angry but confused. His eyes were red-rimmed and his face was pale. Morgiana moved forward and put her hand on Duban's arm. It was hard to tell if it was one of solidarity, sympathy, or to pull him out of everyone's sight. Maybe it was a little of all three. "Duban," she murmured. Maruf approached his son slowly. He clapped an arm over his shoulder, unsure what to do or say. "Son, I'm touched that you love me enough to do this, but I just," Duban said, suddenly at a loss. "It's all I could think about. He deserved to die." But he said it without much conviction. "You planned this from the beginning," Aladdin said slowly. "That's why you wanted to switch with Morgiana and have her try to free the others. That's why you've been so quiet and moody." "I had to," Duban protested half-heartedly. "It had to be done. You know that. You all do. Jafar had to be killed. Nothing else would stop him or end his reign of terror. He would weasel out of whatever punishment you decided on. You know that." "What's done is done," Morgiana said, but she didn't sound convinced. Duban looked at Shireen and Ahmed pleadingly, but they shrank back into the protection of Maruf's robe. The old man took the children aside and whispered soothingly to them. "They've just been through a lot," he said aloud, trying to sound reassuring. But Duban was staring at the floor somewhere past the dead sorcerer, unseeing. Jasmine surveyed the scene around the room and found what she didn't even have the energy to cry. Death, mess, sadness, confusion all around. Not a good place to start. She wandered over to the balcony and looked out. "Too bad there's no way to make myself heard over the chaos," she said with a sigh. "Like, magically." "People of Agrabah, you are free!" she shouted as loudly as she could, raising her arms. "We won!" she added a little weakly. A few people noticed and cheered. "We're going to have to get out of here," Morgiana said to her, turning from Duban for a moment. "You're going to have to go down there into that mess and make sure everyone sees you and hears what the deal is." "How is anyone going to see me in all that chaos? I'm already a head shorter than anyone else, even in my biggest crown." "We'll carry you," Aladdin suggested as cheerfully as he could, "on our shoulders, in a triumphant procession." "I could have made a triumphant procession," the genie muttered, "with horns and confetti and the whole shebang." And so the friends emerged from the palace in a hastily arranged parade. The palace guards were extremely pleased with the new situation. Apparently they liked stability even more than they liked fighting. They raised the portcullis and provided an escort that preceded her, shouting that people would make way for Sultana Jasmine. Jasmine balanced as gracefully as she could on Aladdin and Duban's shoulders. A white silk bandage wrapped her forehead to cover her burn. Duban kept his head down, reduced to silence again. Maruf hobbled behind along with the genie, who was having trouble picking up and putting his feet back down properly. "This walking thing is the worst," he grumbled. "Is the gravity here always bad this time of year?" Shireen and Ahmad tagged shyly behind them, exhausted but a little pleased to be part of the procession and the center of attention. Morgiana strolled last of all, trying to grin but looking very uncomfortable, and it wasn't just because of her limp, bandaged arm. Thieves weren't supposed to be the center of attention. She kept her good hand on her dagger. The crowds closest to the palace weren't fighting anymore. They were waiting to see what was happening with Jafar and Jasmine. News spread quickly when they saw her waving and smiling. Ragged cheers began in a wave. People raised whatever weapons they had in the air and shouted in triumph. And then they joined in behind the parade, singing and dancing. "You all right up there?" Aladdin asked as he shifted her weight on his shoulder. "Absolutely. Head to the Street Rats HQ. The new one," she said with a grin. "Let's bring the party there." They began a slow, winding route through the city, adding to their numbers with more revelers who joined in as they progressed. But from her perch, Jasmine was able to see smaller and slower procession, moving away from the noise, a family carrying a sadly familiar body of the undead boy Jalil, who was now at peace. Neither Agrabah nor its people remained entirely unchanged by what had happened. For some people, nothing would ever be the same again. But a few streets further on, an old friend came bounding out of the crowd and leapt up in the new sultana, practically knocking her down. "Raja!" Jasmine cried, hugging him. The tiger had singed whiskers and still limped a little from when Jafar had injured him. Otherwise, he seemed fine and licked her face like a puppy. After that, there was little need to stay on everyone's shoulders. Raja drew more and more attention to the sultana, and added to her mystique. She kept one demure hand on his back and waved to the other, looking every inch the sultana despite her bare feet and torn clothes. By the time they finally made it back to the bread warehouse, it seemed like all of Agrabah was in the streets partying. Parisa appeared at one of the shadows and walked nonchalantly next to Morgiana and Duban, as if she had always been there. She was smiling, but smelled of smoke. Little Hazan shouted with joy when he saw his friends Shireen and Ahmed safe and sound. He ran up to them, and the three happily danced around the feet of the grown-ups. "Abu," Aladdin called out, cupping his hands around his mouth. He wasn't going to worry about his little friend. Abu would be fine wherever he was. If he had left for a free life somehow in the jungle or on an oasis or somewhere, so much better. Aladdin was happy for him. "Abu!" Angry monkey chitters rained down upon him from the fierce ball of brown and tan that leapt up and down on top of the warehouse. Abu grinned from ear to ear. Abu crossed his arms, almost like a human, and didn't come down to greet him the way Raja had Jasmine. He would, Aladdin knew, sulk for a while and keep his distance, which was fine as long as he was there. The street rats at home were in full festival mode, pouring drinks into golden cups and handing them out to everyone. A small group of musicians had hastily formed a band and were banging on ruckus dance music from a rooftop. Even Widow Golbar was lifting her skirts delicately and showing everyone how they used to dance in the old days, when music really was music. But everyone stopped when they were doing and began cheering wildly when they finally noticed Jasmine. She waved, and the crowd only grew louder. "Congratulations, Sultana," Sarab said, coming forward out of the chaos. He bowed his head and dropped on one knee. Amir and Krascout and Kamaya quickly followed suit, as did Parisa and Morgiana and the rest of the street rats, and then everyone else, side by side, together as one. "Agrabah is yours." "No," Jasmine said, looking out at the sea of guild leaders and the thieves and the genie and all the people of her city. "Agrabah is ours."